No matter who you are or where you go, heading outside even for a few minutes is always worth it. I'm your host, Amy Bouchatz, and here at Humans Outside, we're using the Humans Outside 365 Challenge to build a life around spending time in nature while hearing from fascinating outdoor-minded guests. As a journalist for 19 years, I've let curiosity be my guide. After my husband's injuries from military service, we started looking for a better way to live. That's why we moved sight unseen to Alaska to see if an outdoor-focused life was the answer. Since September 2017, I've personally spent at least 20 consecutive minutes outside every single day, no matter what, to explore how nature can change my life. Ready to hear from experts and outdoor lovers who make heading into nature just a part of who they are while we work to do the same? Let's go! The more time you spend outside, the more you might be thinking about doing what you can to make sure the thing you love so much, nature, is taken care of and around for others to enjoy too. It's a bummer to watch something you enjoy so much disappear or be carelessly shoved aside. In this Best of Humans Outside podcast episode, Meg Carney, an outdoor minimalist, author, and podcast host, shares her tips for outdoor minimalism. So here's my episode with Meg from Season 5, complete with its original introduction. I never spent much time thinking about whether I was interested in conservation or keeping my impact on the natural world around me low until I started spending a lot of time outside. Sure, I was interested in being a good Earth citizen. I recycled, I didn't litter, but that was about the extent of my thought. And then I started spending a lot of time with nature. And of course, how I felt about it changed. All of a sudden, the outdoors was like a close friend of mine. And keeping it awesome wasn't just some kind of good behavior, but it was taking care of something I valued. If you spend a lot of time in nature, you probably feel that way too. And if you're just building that outdoor habit and think you don't care, just wait. Today's guest, Meg Carney, has journeyed into environmentalism, conservation, and by extension, minimalism over her career as an outdoor enthusiast and a writer. She's worked as an outdoor wilderness therapy guide, backpacking guide, rock climbing instructor, and even an organic market farmer. Today, she's a writer and podcaster focused on environmental issues, the outdoor industry, and personal action. You can hear her on her podcast, Outdoor Minimalist, which is a great listen, by the way, or in her upcoming field guide of the same title. And of course, today you can hear her on the Humans Outside podcast here to talk about what we can do to guide our own minimalism. Meg, welcome to Humans Outside.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about all of this with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love your sort of trajectory because you sort of have journeyed into this space yourself in a way a lot of people kind of arrive there, which is incrementally. But first, talk to us about your favorite outdoor space. We like to scene set on the podcast, like we're hanging out outside with you. We're in a place that you love. So describe it for us.
Sure. Gosh, I don't really know. Like a favorite outdoor space is really hard for me to kind of decide. And a lot of times I think that that is because I've been really nomadic. So I've been in a lot of different environments and places throughout my life. And I've just found joy in so many different types of ecosystems. So I often associate my favorite outdoor place with an activity,
Hmm.
which is biking. So that is a very like mobile outdoor activity. So it's hard to associate with a place anyway, I think. And I do a lot of gravel biking with my dog. And so, really, my happiest place outside is anytime I'm biking with him.
Awesome. Okay, so we are going on a bike ride and talking maybe like during a snack, because
Okay.
I am pro activities, but also pro snacks. And
I am also pro snacks.
oh,
Yes.
good. See, we have that in common. And in my experience, it is very difficult to have a meaningful conversation while doing something challenging. But
Mm.
man, snack conversations, peak awesome. Okay. So how did you become somebody who likes to go outside? Walk us through your journey.
Yeah, so I think, thank you for the wonderful intro. And I think that kind of gives a brief glimpse into how that all kind of started. But really, I was one of those lucky people that grew up in a very rural area and mostly spent a lot of time outdoors, out on the prairie in Minnesota, growing up on my grandparents' farm. And my grandfather was a conservationist. And so spending a lot of time with him outside, I was just it was just a part of my life and a part of my family's life. So day-to-day things, we just spent a lot of time outside together. And then when we moved off of the farm, it was the same. We every summer we spent time outside, whether it was just sitting on the deck, going for a walk, going to the beach for a swim, or family vacations were really centered around traveling and camping, other activities. I'm trying to think. My older brother and my dad were both very involved in Boy Scouts. And because both my parents were working, I often would just tag along to all of the Boy Scout like trips and adventures. And so I was just like an honorary Boy Scout before all genders were welcome into the Scouts. So I think that was basically how I got involved in outside recreation or outdoor recreation because it's always been a part of my life. So I've
Right.
never had a moment that I was like, I don't want to be outside because I've just was basically born outside.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned in the intro, I think for a lot of people, conservation or minimalism or reducing your footprint comes down to this idea of it goes from being like a good thing that you do because it's the right thing to do to being how you take care of a friend. Did you feel like that was true for you? And if so, like how does that journey into like that space look?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, at its core, I mean, conservation, minimalism, environmentalism, I think they all have a really similar why. Like, why are we doing this activity? And if you're associating that with preservation of outdoor spaces, especially if you're someone participating in those things, then nature is essentially one of your best friends. So, like, in the mindset that you're going forward with, is yeah, you are taking care of a friend in that way because Mother Earth is your friend.
Yeah.
And really, like, as you integrate more into those environments, you feel the stronger connection as well.
Right. Right. So when I dive into some of these subjects like we're tackling today, minimalism and environmentalism and that kind of thing, uh, I want to define stuff, okay? Because so much of what we talk about here on the podcast can have broad definitions, but we're not always working with that. Um, so I think that's true with the words minimalism and minimalist. Uh, that can make some people think like tiny houses, right? Like
Mhm.
minimalism, or like Marie Kondo, or minimalist, like be one of those people who somehow manages to never have any personal trash, you know? Uh, so they're like, it's like a very broad range of how that can look from a practical standpoint. So when you say minimalism and outdoor minimalist, what do you mean?
Yeah, so I do think everyone listening to this probably has some type of preconceived notion of what minimalism actually is.
Right.
And like in a traditional sense, minimalism was associated a lot with the arts, so sculpting and painting, different forms of expression like music, using shorter, more repetitive phrases. And then when we think of it as people in today's society, we think of it more as approach to life and focus on those material possessions. So like Marie Kondo, like you're saying, that's very much a material possession focus when it comes to
Hmm.
minimalism.
Hmm.
And so, in a sense, minimizing the number of items you own becomes very, very tied to that recognition or how we recognize minimalism today. And to some, that will look like being able to fit everything into your backpack or, like you were saying, into a tiny house. But for other people, that includes owning a 4-bedroom house, a 2-car garage, and raising a family at the same time. So there's a bunch of different individual versions of minimalism. And to me, my understanding of how minimalism fits into my life is that physical possessions aren't necessarily the core. The way I view it, minimalism is a lot closer to essentialism. So it's me asking what is essential in my life. And so for me, minimalism brings forth this level of self awareness to what you truly need in your specific life circumstance, and then a realization that your needs are relative to all of your life changes. So, what is essential can then be associated with a person's ability to
Hmm.
be fully present and in the moment whether it is you're sitting down to eat a meal, or you're out on a bike ride, or you're getting dressed for the day. You're present and in the moment. And basically, without being a little too ranty here, um, what I mean by this is like consumerism for many of us is an escape from reality, and we use it as a distraction of excess to hide from other things that might be stressing us out in our day to day life. And a mindset of minimalism is what can gradually push you from feeling like you should consume more or you need to consume more. And it becomes an evaluation of your needs versus wants. And so you're shifting from feeling like something other, I'm trying to think how to say this. You're shifting from feeling like something other than your own being can make you feel fulfilled.
Hmm.
And as I've continued to grow and learn in the journey of minimalism, because I don't think there's really an endpoint for me on this in this space, is I now see minimalism as that self-discovery that is bridging my ability to identify necessity while pairing it with intentionality in my own self-expression. And
Hmm.
so my foundation here is outdoor minimalism, just because that is what applies best to my life, because outdoor recreation is so integrated. And um, that is like my day-to-day activity, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And in
Yeah.
writing the Outdoor Minimalist book, I did actually end up writing a more succinct definition of what an outdoor minimalist is. And I'll read them quick. There's two parts. So, an outdoor minimalist, defined in my book, is an individual striving to minimize their impact in their relationships with nature, and one who consumes thoughtfully and only what they need, leaving the wilderness better than they found it.
Hmm.
So there's a few layers there. And some of the listeners may recognize like parts of that definition coming from different areas. And that's because all of the values and ideas of outdoor minimalism already existed. I didn't reinvent anything here. I just compiled a lot of different concepts that already exist and put them in a new place, basically. So
Yeah.
I took things like minimalism, zero waste, essentialism, environmentalism, and took pieces of that that were really, really relevant to the outdoor industry and then
Hmm.
applied it into that realm.
Um, Two things. One, there's nothing new under the sun. So,
Mhm.
how we create and apply things to ourselves is the act of making something new in that moment. So, good job. Um, there's or slash there's nothing wrong with that. Two, people are going to say, but why can't I just read your book? And the answer is it does not come out yet. So, real fast, tell us when your book is being published. Um, and because I, of course, had the same question in prepping for this interview, and of course, rapidly discovered that the book is yet to come. So, when can people find that?
Yeah, so pre-orders are available for the book, but the book is not hitting any shelves until September 1st of this year, so 2022.
And if
And
the book interests you, pre-orders to an author, I can tell you, do matter. So,
Mhm.
feel free to pre-order it.
Yeah, and that was kind of the genesis of the podcast as well. It was like I knew that the book was a long ways out, but I was really passionate about these ideas and kind of wanted to keep the conversation going. So a lot of the concepts in the book are discussed on the podcast, but in a broader light.
Right. We like to be very, very practical here on this podcast, so we're going to talk about that here in a second. Like minimalism, in the definition that you just gave, can be also very broad or very narrow, right? Because it's really led by how you interact with what you're doing, but can also still be a little scary sounding, because it can sound like, especially if you default towards being somebody who buys things new, or who, I know one of the things that people tend to do is sort of over gear in terms of like they don't know what they need, so they get everything. Um, that can be a little scary. Uh, or people maybe think about it in terms of being like reducing that footprint, like lean towards that part of the definition. And then they feel like guilty, right? Because the response when you're not doing that is say, oh man, like I really appreciate the ability to use plastic silverware when I want to, and that doesn't sound like that fits in there. So, so like, is there like what's a happy middle ground for people who are just getting started with this idea?
Well, really, it's all about your current lifestyle
Mm,
and areas of change that you're able to identify and sustain. And
mm,
so I think for a lot of people, especially when they hear the phrase zero waste, that can
right,
be really jarring and overwhelming because we do have those images of a lot of the zero waste activists or influencers that are like, the last 5 years, I have created only waste that fits in this tiny mason jar.
right.
And for a lot of people, that is not realistic. That's not approachable. I think there's value
I mean,
in
it's
that.
cool,
Yeah, yeah, there's a
but
lot of value to that. But it creates a barrier, I think, like a big barrier to entry where I think minimalism is a little more approachable because it feels more like easier to personalize, at least to me.
right.
And I think because our culture is so focused around consumerism and consumption, it's kind of impossible for people to do a hard stop and
Mm,
cold turkey. I'm not going to buy anything. It's
right.
just it's that is a scary thing to just all of a sudden you're making all of these changes. When you're approaching minimalism or zero waste, whatever you want to call it, a lot of it has to do with building new routines and habits. So you can really think about any type of habit that or behavior you've had to change before in your life. And for me, that usually looks like sitting down, doing some type of evaluation, assessing things in my life, and then identifying goals that I deem essential. And
Mm,
so when I think of that, I'm trying to think of a current example. So like at the start of 2022, I wanted to reconstruct a better morning routine, something that would set me up in a better mindset for the day. So a couple of things in that where I want to stay off my phone for the first 45 minutes of the day, do a short stretch or yoga session, and then journal or work on therapy homework. And for me, if I were to all of a sudden say tomorrow, wake up and be like, every single day, I'm going to do these things. And if I were to add all those things up, it'd maybe take like 2 hours or something. That's not
right.
realistic for me.
Right.
I'd maybe last 3 days if I'm being optimistic, and I'd get really burnt out. And so you have to build up to any type of change. And so maybe that means I'll stretch for 10 minutes and I won't be on my phone then while I'm stretching and making coffee. And then instead of journaling at first, I'll just sit and have coffee with my dogs like I have been doing. And then I can add other things later. And it's the same thing when you want to make
Mm,
other lifestyle changes. So, say you are identifying where waste is in your life. And in episode 22 of my podcast, I talk about how to do a waste audit. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about here is say you track your kitchen waste specifically, since a lot of our
mhm.
waste is coming from food packaging. And you
Yes, it does.
yes, so much of it. And you identify, okay, a lot of my food packaging waste is coming from
Salad
they
bags.
yes, there, that's a good example.
My
Salad
food
bags.
waste is like doing a conga line before my memory eyes right now while you're talking. This is like all of my like little
Yes.
plastic packaging is like doing a little dance. Okay, keep going.
Yes. So we'll just roll with the salad bag
Yeah.
example. So you've identified one area where you're like, okay, well, we have a salad for lunch 3 days a week. So are there ways that I can eliminate this one piece of trash? And so maybe that means that you buy full heads of lettuce and integrate that with spinach or kale or other types of greens that you can buy unpackaged. I guess you can't really buy spinach unpackaged, but anyway, um,
Well,
so
you
you
can.
identify.
It's just full of sand.
Yes, maybe you grow it in your garden. I don't know. So you can then integrate that. So, like next week, I'm going to buy heads of lettuce and cut that
Mm,
up ahead of time and store that
mhm,
in my fridge in containers I already have. So then you cut those bags out. And then say you
mhm.
do that for a month. And then you can identify a new area of waste. And maybe that is um, sparkling water cans.
Why are you talking about the things I love?
I also love sparkling water. And a friend of mine was doing kind of a purge on their kitchen appliances because they're remodeling their kitchen. And so they were trying to find people to give away appliances they didn't use anymore too. And I lucked out and I got to be the friend that got the soda stream because she's like, "You drink so much sparkling water." I was like, "Wow, thank you for cutting all of this waste out of my life for me."
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I'm feeling a little convicted right now. Keep going.
so those are just like a few like minor examples, but then I think as those things become a habit and you feel that's more second nature. You're practicing it daily and you no longer really have to think about it. Like when you go to the grocery store now and you know you're going to be making salads, you're just going to gravitate to the non-packaged
Right.
options because that's
Right.
something that you have built in and that's something that you've created as a habit
Yep.
and it won't be something you overthink as much.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, you're like singing the song of our people here on Humans Outside because what you're talking about is exactly what we talk about with building an outdoor habit, right?
Mhm.
So, when we talk about deciding that you want to be somebody who spends time in nature every day, we're talking about adding a habit to your life. And some of the very practical basic steps of that are to like pick what you're going to do and pick something that you'll actually do, which you just touched on, right? Because if you say, I'm going to go outside for an hour a day, probably not gonna do that, every day. I mean, you might do it some days, but, it's not gonna work out every day because life happens. Um, although it's a fantastic goal, or if you say that like any sort of these laudable big goals, it's so much simpler just to start small with something that you know for a fact that you can actually do, as you're saying with your morning routine, and sort of scale it in. And then once you have a handle on that and it becomes that second nature, like I don't even think about when I guess there are some days that I'm busy that I do think, okay, like when am I going to go outside today? But I never forget to go outside. I think that's the difference. Like there's never a day that I'm like I get to the end like, oh crap, like I did not do that today. Um there are days that I go through the day like I'll do that later. I'll do that later. I'll do that later. Like it's always in my mind that I need to do it. And then by the end of the day I'm like, oh man, like later is now. It's like and usually that's when the weather's bad, right? Like, "Oh, it's really windy. Let's wait until the wind dies." And we're waiting, and we're waiting, and now it's nighttime. So that still happens, but I think there's really something to be said for using that habit, the things you already know about habit to impact other parts of your life. So, when it comes to a minimalist habit, um in your life that's already building this habit about going outside, maybe that's the next step. Maybe it's not like extending your outdoor time, although that's a great next step too. Maybe it's thinking about how this habit that you've had of going outside every day is now impacting the rest of your life and cutting yourself off from the cans of seltzer water, which I mean, why do we keep talking about me? It's rude. So Oh, I okay, the listeners know that I'm dry. I don't drink alcohol, but man, I spend more money on that seltzer water than I ever did on alcohol.
It is expensive, and I think sometimes, that is a part of going into minimalism and even more sustainable swaps is I think people will be pleasantly surprised with just general more intentionality, especially when it comes to things like grocery shopping, that you're probably gonna be better at sticking to your budget.
Yeah, I mean, straight facts. Hey humans, just a quick break to remind you that if you want to build your own outdoor habit, the Humans Outside 365 Challenge is a great way to get started. Cool and exclusive challenge swag, including a finisher medal and a decal, is waiting for you. All you need to do is visit humansoutside.com/challenge. Don't get left out. Go to humansoutside.com/challenge to learn more now. Okay, back to the show. So what we're talking about though here is individual decisions, right? Like you are making individual decisions for your own habits in the grocery store or as a part of your day or in your own home. Um, One of the things that people ways people talk themselves out of doing that is that they're just one person. And being
Mhm.
environmentally minded seems like something we all have to do for it to make an impact. Instead of just making your one person, salad bag habit change. So, is that true? Is that not true? Why is that not true? Talk to us about the importance or lack of importance, I guess, could be possible, but I don't think so, of individual habits. I mean, I don't think that's what you're gonna say. So, let's
Yeah.
talk about the individual decisions and why they matter.
That is one really big debate in any discussion regarding environmentalism and those types of changes in your life. And one of my favorite quotes is from Jane Goodall, and she says, "Think globally, but act locally." And so I think we
Mm,
can really apply that to individual change, where it's you're looking at the big picture, but really you only have control over so much. So control the life around you and the things that you can actually change and implement. And unfortunately, there isn't really a cut and dry answer because individuals and large corporations are relatively integrated in the grand scheme of like market and behavior and things like that. And so I'm going to get really nerdy for a second and talk a little bit about numbers and greenhouse gas emissions, if you're cool with that.
yeah,
Um,
nerd out, friend,
Okay,
go.
great. I love talking about these things. And so, but when we're looking at things in this realm, it can become discouraging, which is partially why I want to bring it up. So, in the United States specifically, the average household is producing around 7.5 tons of CO2 per year. And that doesn't seem like a big number, especially if we're talking about households, and the average household is like between 2 and 3 people.
Mm,
And we also have to take into account that some people are gonna, or some households are gonna have higher consumption, usually people with more money that have bigger houses, travel more, etc. But the average overall is 7.5 tons per year, and most sources can agree with that. So if you go and Google this, you'll probably find a number similar to this. Anyway, of that 7.5 tons per year that each household might be emitting, most of that is coming from things like heating and cooling our homes, including refrigeration. And then the rest comes from the food we eat and the impact that that food has on the environment while it's being produced. And alone, that number doesn't feel very dramatic, especially when we compare it to, say, like a corporation that is having greenhouse gas emissions around 107 million metric tons per year. I think that's one of the top ones in the United States. And so side by side, yes, that
mm,
corporation is obviously producing more than your household or my household or both of our households combined.
right.
But then we can look at the population as a whole. So in the United States, there's around 329 million people, but we're talking about households. So let's say 123 million households in the United States, just as a ballpark. And so if you multiply that 123 million by 7.5, we now have 922.5 million tons of greenhouse
Mm,
gases, or CO2 specifically. And that means that all of our households end up emitting more than the biggest corporation in this example. And so that's not a perfect example. There's a lot of variables. So we can't concretely say everything I just said is facts. We can't concretely say that is true. But I think it's a good generalized example to represent that collective action can influence and compare to large scale or corporate change. And so another example of this would be, let's talk about boycotts. Boycotts are really popular these days, and I think that's really great, especially
mhm,
in terms of like corporate change. And so, say everyone in the United States suddenly stopped buying Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola because we all said we are boycotting them because they're continuously the largest plastic polluters year after year. And so, if that boycott continued, maybe it spread across the world, wouldn't you think their dramatic loss in revenue would influence some type of change? Maybe they would sell in aluminum only,
mm,
strictly aluminum instead of plastic. And aluminum is
mhm,
an easier to recycle material. And so when companies and corporations are producing more pollution and emissions, we can't argue against that. But individuals collectively,
mm,
we also cause damage and we are also consumers, and we can also influence those market changes. And so I would
mhm,
say that individual change does matter, but it can feel discouraging if you're only looking at yourself. And so you need to think larger scale, but then make changes individually. And if people want a more concise and like evaluative picture and answer to this question without me rambling on and on and on, I recommend checking out the podcast How to Save a Planet. They have an episode called Is Your Carbon Footprint BS?
Mm.
And they go into a lot of detail and they compare it side by side. And so you can kind of have a better understanding and grasp of that.
Yeah, that's great. And this really dovetails into the next thing I wanted to talk about. So we've already pretty much touched on this, which is working with the outdoor industry or with all industry, I guess, to keep a minimalist focus. But I think the outdoor industry is particularly interesting to talk about on this point because theoretically we're all trying to do the same thing, which is go outside and use the outside. We all need to eat dinner, so making a dime is not a bad thing because it enables you to buy said dinner and your bags of salad. But but um, at this flip side, there's a lot of industry behavior that's not environmentally minded. Like it's just towards making a dime and not towards preserving the use of the thing we all like to use. So is there maybe a pullout from what we just talked about specific to the outdoor industry, or is it a because you used, beverage bottles as an example. Is there an example of how to do that with the outdoor industry that maybe has an impact because it's not the it's like smaller? I don't know what I'm trying to ask, but you tell me.
Yeah, no, I think I understand your question. But like you said, the outdoor industry, it's still an industry and it's largely driven by economics. So
Right.
we have companies that represent sustainability and create wonderful models for others, and we need more of that. But at the end of the day, people still need to put food on the table. They are running a business, and so they're trying to sell consumer goods. And I think um, when we are considering those things, we do have to come back to some type of mindset. And we do have to consider what is really fueling your outdoor adventures? What is your why? And keep returning to that. So, why do you love being outside? Why do you pursue these adventures? And for most of us, that's because it makes us feel connected to ourselves and nature. But then as you are getting more and more integrated into outdoor recreation, then you'll also begin to consider like, what if those landscapes no longer exist? What if there's less access like there is becoming now? And what if we simply run these landscapes to the point of no repair? Then what is the point of a fancy new ski jacket? What's the point of getting a new bike? What's the point of any type of gear when there's nowhere to use it? And so the outdoor industry, still in pursuit of selling to consumers, but I think a lot of our conversation around environmentalism is largely focused on things like leave no trace, which is very essential and very important. But we're focusing a lot on simply how we recreate and not what brings us to the recreation, not how we're getting outside, like our transportation to get there, not the things we're wearing or the gear we're using. And I believe that needs to be more of the focus of conversation. I think we need to keep the conversation going, but I think we could shift it more to talk about what is the impact of those consumer goods? What is the impact of the gear you buy? And as consumers, we can ask ourselves those questions. We can ask, like, is this jacket going to last me 10, 15 years? Or is there some type of planned obsolescence that's requiring me to buy a new one in 2 years? Can I repair or repurpose those items? Are companies need to be putting these types of models into place that allow for recycling, reusing, repurposing instead of just extracting more virgin materials, because unless we're treating them like finite materials, which they are, then we're going to use them all up. And so there's a lot. I feel like I'm really ranting right now, but there is a lot of positives happening, a lot of positive changes. But I think until we focus the conversation specifically on the damages happening around production in the outdoor industry, then I'm not sure we're going to really be able to preserve or conserve a lot of natural spaces. And if you want a more specific example, we can talk about petrol based materials or textiles like polyester, because that is a really commonly used material in a lot of our outdoor clothing. It's used in a lot of other fabrics, like for backpacks, tents, polyester, and nylon. And those are a synthetic material, right? But there's a reason that we use them so much. They're extremely durable and they have all of the qualities that we really need to get outside and really want. So, most of the time, they're generally moisture wicking. Like I said, they're very durable. They're generally easy to clean. There's so many good qualities about them. But something that's interesting is in the world of textiles, polyester hasn't even been around that long, maybe 80 years or so. I think it was invented in 1941. And then it didn't become popular until the 70s. But now, if we're flashing forward to today, about 60% or maybe a little more of all of our clothing in and out of the outdoor industry contains some type of polyester. So that includes blends. And that type of growth in an industry seems crazy to me, but there's a reason for that beyond the durability, and that's because it's cheap to produce and it's more accessible to produce. And so if you're starting a company in the outdoor industry, maybe you want to make more sustainable hiking pants or something like that. It's going to be easier for you to start if you are making those pants out of polyester or some type of polyester blend because it's easier to source. It's cheaper to produce. So you probably creating more revenue for yourself versus going after some type of natural fiber that in the long run has a lower impact. It's not having an impact, a negative impact on the environment during every stage of its life cycle. It's just more sustainable in general, but it's going to be harder to source. It's going to be far more expensive and it's going to be harder to sell to consumers because we've been told polyester is the go-to. Like that is what we should want. And since the outdoor industry specifically, it's like a 374 something billion-dollar industry. There's a lot of influence there. There's a lot of damage that can be done, either positive or negative. And so consumers in the industry can push for more change with established companies, and then
Right.
companies and corporations can also influence change in and out of the outdoor industry by being kind of a front runner, being like, this is no longer acceptable. And this is the change that I want to make and that we should be making because we care about these spaces.
Yeah. So, I said earlier we like to be really practical. You have already laid out a bunch of super practical steps for us, right? Being intentional, starting small, um, looking at this as a new habit, and then scaling up or scaling in to hold companies accountable for the kinds of things that you're asking them to create for you. All of those things go back to another thing we touch on here all the time, which is intentionality. So, like, you have to know what you want before you do any of those things. You mentioned an audit earlier. Is there other practical or baby steps that we can take towards becoming more minimalist minded?
Yeah, I mean, probably a lot of different things, but the biggest I think the biggest thing or the biggest step people can take is to always, always, always start with what you have. Because I think a lot of times we're looking
Mm,
for a solution outside of ourselves. And most of the time, you're going to find more sustainable swaps, or it's just going to be more sustainable in general if you're starting with what you have. So that also includes your outdoor gear. So if you want to do some type of waste audit in your outdoor equipment, you can do that. You can evaluate what you use, how you're maintaining it, how often you use it, and also like whether anything needs to be repaired in general. And then like returning back to those types of questions and those types of things when you begin seeking or searching for a new piece of gear. Like, do you actually need it? What is your intention behind buying this? Do you have something that can already fulfill that specific desire in your life and fit that need? And then from
mhm.
there, if that's not the case, there's other small changes that you could make instead of immediately gravitating towards gear roundups online, which are very useful tools in terms of research and understanding gear. But making small changes like instead of buying something online, maybe you go to a retail store and you experience that piece of gear in person and you learn more about it. And then maybe you find a consignment shop near you and check to see if they have something comparable to the new one there. And so, like, it
Mhm.
takes more effort. I will say that making these types of changes takes more effort, but there are ways that you can get around buying something brand new, and that will help divert things away from the landfill. And then other really practical things in terms of minimalism, I would say, is to find community and build community, because having those
Mhm.
people as resources, because everyone's kind of in a different stage, can be really influential. Because if you're not sure what to do with something or how to dispose of something or where to go for any question really, like, you will have a community, whether it's digital or in person, that you can talk about those things and talk about your struggles, and you can feel less alone, and it keeps the conversation going, which I think is one of the most important things. Is if we're continuing to
Right.
talk about it, it'll be top of mind, and it's easier to implement that stuff.
Yeah, such good tips. Thank you. Thank you for those. Sometimes at the end of our podcast, I kind of chuckle to myself because the questions we ask don't necessarily line up with the vibe we are going for. But I do love to hear what people say about these two questions because of all the different perspectives we come at for it. And the first, they both involve gear. So we think about gear as being something you have to buy new or anything like that. But I'm really excited to hear your thoughts from a minimalist standpoint. So, do you have some gear that you use outside, a favorite or most essential or both, that you just particularly love? With the knowledge that this does not have to mean going out and buying something brand new that's made of polyester from a certain large store.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of a piece of gear that I use for a lot of different activities, so it fits into, like, more than just something like cycling, because I really wanna choose my bike, but that's not, like, really relevant or applicable to a lot of people. So I would say this is not something that I bought used, actually, so it might be interesting to people, and it is, an adventure towel, and the company is called Lava Linens, and they have a bunch of different sizes of towels, but they primarily use flax linen. I think some of their other materials are hemp, and both of those are natural materials. But the towel itself, I think I have the mini everything towel. I think that's what it's called. I could be wrong.
Mm.
And it is like a very packable towel. It seems like kind of heavy for the size, but of all the towels, it's probably one that I have used the most. And I literally use it every day almost, especially because I hike with my dogs a lot, and in the winter they get so wet. Even not in the winter, they just find all the puddles. And so I like to keep it in my car. I bring it with backpacking. I bring it with bike packing. I use it all of the time, and it is so absorbent. Like, it blows my mind. I have 3 dogs, 2 of them are huskies, and one of them, he gets wet all of the time, and I used to have to use, like, 2 full size, like, regular cotton towels to dry him off, and now I can use this, like, little travel towel to dry him off, and it just blows my mind. So that's my favorite piece of gear by far, and it seems random, but I think outdoor people use towels more than they think.
Yeah, also, I think that the best gear recommendations I've heard when I ask this question are supremely beautifully w um, practical, right? Like,
Mhm.
it's their items like the towel you're talking about, that can be used in all sorts of circumstances or across maybe it's like a wide variety of activities is the lean on there, right? Like, um,
Mm, mhm.
I, sort of infamously am in love with these, puffy pants that are, they're like a puffy jacket, but they're pants, okay? And, partially because I live somewhere very cold and because we like to spend a lot of time outside, I use those so often. I I use them when we're camping. I use them when we're not camping. I just keep them around and I do not hesitate to put on those pants. And so you might think of those as being like an outdoor item that you use when you're chillaxing at the top of a mountain or only staying in a cabin or something. But that's not at all how I use them. And the towel kind of goes the same way, right? Like maybe this is marketed as like a campsite towel or whatever. I mean, I don't know, but I could see how that would be a thing. And you're like, no, it's like in my car, it's in my garage. Like it's here, it's there, it's everywhere. And it's the Roy Kent of towels, and so you really use this thing, and that's what makes it a minimalist item for you. If I bought that towel and I never
Mhm,
used it, it would not be a minimalist item for me. It would be just
mhm,
another piece of gear, right? And that could go for anything. So I think it comes down to like, how are you using stuff, and are you being, here's that word again, intentional about what it is that you're purchasing to make sure that it is actually worth having. So I think that's a very cool recommendation. Thank you. Um,
mhm.
Last question. We like to walk ourselves out, imagining ourselves in our guests' favorite outdoor moment. So, like, just, kind of leave us with this picture of something that doesn't have to be your favorite, because we've talked about the fact you have a lot of those, but like maybe a happy place sort of outside that you like to go back to.
Like, set the scene? That's what you want me to do?
Like, give us a scene, baby. Do some scene setting.
Oh,
Yeah.
geez, okay, I'll think back. I feel like a lot of times we revert back to, like, childhood memories, so I'll think back to, like,
Hmm.
we just had a wonderful picnic overlooking this, um valley on the prairie, and there's a nice stream kind of going through. There's some deer jumping through the woods, and the sun is beginning to set. And on the prairie, there's always a really nice breeze that has like a really unique sound because of all of the grasses rustling around you, but also a unique smell because of that same reason, because the wind is blowing through those grasses, and um, you really feel a part of that landscape. I have always, probably because I grew up on the prairie, but um, yeah, I don't really know how else to set the scene, but yeah, just walking away from that beautiful valley at sunset, and you do have to turn your back at one point, but your senses are still so alert at the time. You have all of the different smells and the different noises surrounding you, whether it's like birds chirping or the grass rustling, and yeah, the end.
Yeah. I love it. The end. Beautiful. Meg, thank you for joining us on Humans Outside. Man, do I appreciate you. Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of Humans Outside. Help me out by leaving a 5-star rating or review wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help other listeners find the podcast too. Now, go get outside. Until next time, we'll see you out there.